Good afternoon. My name is Jorge Otero-Pailos. I teach in the preservation program here at the School of Architecture, and I'll be moderating the next panel. I'm going to introduce the three speakers all at once at the beginning. That way we save time. So our first speaker is Horacio Torrent. He's an architecture scholar at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, is an architect by the National University of Rosario, Argentina, where he also received his PhD in architecture. He's taught at the Universidad Nacional del Litoral in Argentina from 1990 to 97, and acted as director of the Rosario University Center for Urban and Regional Research from 1990 to 94, and was coordinator of the project of development at the Center for Information and Documentation of Sergio Larraín García Moreno at the PUC between 1996 and 2001. He's conducted research on the beginnings of modern architecture and has published work on the Chilean and Latin American architectural culture in various national and international books and magazines. He currently serves as Director of Research and Graduate Studies and as Professor of the School of Architecture at the PUC. The speaker following him will be Carlos Labarta. He teaches architecture and design studio at the University of Zaragoza in Spain. He's an architect by the University of Navarra. He was a Fulbright Fellow and received his Master's in Design Studies from Harvard University in 1990. He received the Outstanding Doctorate Award for ETSAUN in 2000. In 2003, he became Professor of Architectural Design. He's been Professor of Projects at ETSA, the University of Valladolid, and visiting professor at the University of Navarra. In 2006, he received the Eisenhower Fellowship, and his research primarily focuses on modern architecture in the 20th century. His work has been disseminated in journals and various international conferences and won several awards, including the Mercadal García Award, the Award of Planning of the City of Madrid in 1991. The following speaker, the third speaker for the afternoon, will be Mark Wigley, which saves us a lot of time because I don't really need to introduce him. So I want to thank you all for attending the afternoon session and thank the speakers in advance for their presentations. And with that, please join me in welcoming Horacio Torrent.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you very much to the Columbia University and the University of Navarra. I'm going to talk about Latin American architecture since 1945, the exhibition organized by the Museum of Modern Art here in New York in 1955. That has been commonly regarded as an information source for this topic. In this occasion, as part of a work in progress, it will be exposed from a different point of view, assembling fragments from other interpretations of Latin American cities, converting the book or the catalog into an archive, analyzing its interpretative paradigms, and reviewing its reception and its value in the context of contemporary architectural culture. And by paying attention to some parts which have not been observed closely by the historiography, approach some hypotheses indicating that exhibitions could also refer to place where they originate rather than the topic they are facing. Documentary films. The film Sao Paulo, the fastest growing city in the world, showcased the expansive growth of the city, the strength of its economic activity, and the way in which urban construction was a part of it, showing new buildings such as the Esther building by Álvaro Vital Brasil in the middle. The film Belo Horizonte, A Planet City with a Plan, also showed economic activity in the region, but emphasized was on the way engineers and architects developed the city by constructing office and apartment buildings. This film showed in particular the new district of Pampula developed, and I quote, in the traditional ways of the mineros, according to a plan, with recently built premises such as the casino, the yacht club, and the House of Dancing by Oscar Niemeyer. The frames belong to a series of films made by Jules Bryan, the South American series, between 41 and 45 as part of the strategy of the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, headed by Nelson Rockefeller. Bryan, as well, was well known as a documentalist for capturing the Nazi invasion to Poland, was asked to carry out a series of films that would bring closer to the American public the situation of Latin America in the context of the good neighbor policy, which increased the beginning of the Second World War. The film showed the role this city plays in the development of the country and emphasized on the construction boom. Cities of Latin America, Housing and Planning to the South was published in 1944 as the result of another journey, 6 months journey, through the region. Was the trip made by Francis Bioli between 41 and 42 and promoted by the US State Department. Constitutes a magnificent survey of the institutional situation of urbanism in the countries of the region, and in a sense, Bioli's diagnosis on the situation of the Latin American cities coincides with those exposed by Julian Bryan in his films. Here showing, for example, the Ministry of Health and Education in Rio. Latin American architecture, the MoMA's exhibition was originated as equivalent of the previous one, built in USA, post-war architecture, completed 2 years early in 1953. It was the product of an intense expedition of Henry Russell Hitchcock and Rolly McKenna to the region with an open, uneven approach of each place they visited. As you can see in this map of Latin America as transformed by Henry Russell Hitchcock's selection of work, I draw this as maybe as a surrealist map. The works were analyzed in a sequence order by countries, articulating this course through the most relevant study cases. The Library of the University City in Mexico by Juan O'Gorman, because of the murals applied to the modern box. In Venezuela, the works of Carlos Raúl Villanueva in the University City and the Polar Building by Vega and Galia. In La Habana, the Tropicana Cabaret by Marx Borges, because of the free forms, just to show some examples. In the book published with the exhibition, Hitchcock listed the topics that characterize Latin American architecture in particular. First, restriction of materials and the modern adoption of reinforced concrete. Second, the attention paid to the climate variations and the regular use of sun control elements, such as the brise-soleil. And third, plus a significant strength in cultural tradition, present in quite considerable use of colors and ceramic tiles. However, counting with first-hand knowledge of the building, Hitchcock visions contain some of the common topics to modern architecture's historiography. the objectifying consideration of architecture, an autonomous stylistic approach, and the ideas of the founding of a new tradition and its positive evolution. Sources. However, the exhibition was the result of a research journey. An important part of the work presented were already well known, mostly through printed formats. The Casa del Puente by Amancio Williams, in the first time published in L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in 1947, the Brazilian works were actually overpublished after the exhibition of Brazil Builds in the MoMA exhibition. Mexican architecture in Irving Meyer's Mexican Modern Architecture, published in New York in 1952. Stamo Papadakis' volume on Oscar Niemeyer had already reached its second edition and was also just published in Japanese. Hitchcock assumed that the connection between the different countries of the region were scarce. His book would collaborate in the recognitions between them. However, the connection between local architectural cultures were far more than those he could expect. In Chile, 2 monographic issues on Brazilian architecture had already been published in Arquitectura y Construcción, the Chilean magazine. Arquitectura, by the Society of Uruguayan Architects, published a review on Mexico in September 1955. Or the works in Venezuela were published also in September 1955 in Arquitectura Cuba, in La Habana. The best example of how intensely articulated was Latin American architectural culture was the Pan American Congress of Architectures, opening at the Aula Magna of the University City in Caracas, with the presence of Rino Levi, Brazilian architects, and Carlos Raúl Villanueva, among others, in September 1955. Critical reception. Response to the exhibition and to the book were widespread, from Architectural Record to Habitat magazine by Lina Bobardi, or Módulo, the owner journal by Oscar Niemeyer, or Brazil Arquitectura Contemporánea, led by Enrique Mindlin, who highlighted the exhibition's merely informative character. In Peru, Luis Vera, a Chilean architect resident in Bogotá, Colombia, published a highly critical article in the magazine El Arquitecto Peruano that would be later republished in the Argentinian magazine Nuestra Arquitectura. The article held that, and I quote, Latin American architecture has more to offer the world than just some worn-out clichés of brise-soleil, shell bolts, and tiles. It is also true that 46 examples here and there might not be enough to present the architectural movement of the continent. Gordon Graham published in the Journal of the Royal Institute of British Architects one of the most critical comments. He wrote, and I quote, "The scope of the subject and the scholarship of the author ensure a stimulating book, but not even Professor Hitchcock can deal adequately with the remarkable achievement of the Latin American countries in the space of 53 pages of text. What is how needed is more serious, a major account of this development and the great creativity spirit which underlies it." End of quote. Contemporaries. In some way, looking at the exhibition in the historical perspective, it's appeared to us as somehow dated or maybe outdated in regard to the topics that were emerging at the same time. Rainer Banham's article on the new brutalism appeared almost simultaneously at the exhibition in December 1955 in Architectural Record. And the Architectural Review presented also for the first time the Monsanto Plastic House, the same time, December 1955. both proposing a different conceptual and critical dimension for the architectural culture of the moment. The same issues that presented MoMA's exhibition show the greater interest on the book Italy Builds by Kidder Smith, repeating the formula of Brazil Builds, and the critic of Finnish exhibition in architectural record also named it Finland Builds. The exhibition partly repeats an interpretative paradigm originally born around Brazil Builds, that is, the synthesis of modern principles and local conditions. But when carefully reading certain signs already present in the books, an original form of interpretation of the urban condition can manifest. Urban dimensions. Perhaps the most interesting approach, both the exhibition and the text, lies into the urban dimension. The photo of Caracas, Sao Paulo, La Habana, or the amazing photo of Copacabana Avenue in Rio from above show the contrast between freedom of the beach and the alignment of the new buildings that shaped urban facade facing the sea. The special section devoted to urban facades confirmed the existence of a new analytical and interpretative dimension. It shows 16 photographs of facades from different cities. Although the proposal is to show different types of facade treatment, Hitchcock drew attention to the strikingly contemporary air of most Latin American cities. I quote, "is above all due to the presence of great numbers of new office buildings and in some cases apartment blocks rising above the generally low urban structures of early periods." The significance of the presentations lies in the assembly mechanism itself, in which, in an almost surreal operation, the objects found in the different cities compose an analog Latin American city, which, remember me, Aldo Rossi, analogous city, of course. What are the reasons lying behind this assembly? The material reality of Latin America city allows it, but the idea also seems to come from the point of view of the interpreter. In one hand, the Latin American city was becoming the decisive factor in the development of capitalist economy through the region. The announced construction boom took place in the city and gave meaning to a new form of approach between the US and Latin America under Truman's Point 4 and Development Aid. Especially since Latin America was the locus of the largest US private investment abroad, as announced by Forum in June 55. And I quote, "The year 1955 found the US building industry hard at work in almost every country of the free world. Our architects and planners are creating whole new towns. But what is the significance of this tremendous activity? First, it means we are building up the basic welfare of other nations, creating climates unfavorable to communism, readying countries for industrialization and democratic independence, making them prosperous enough to buy more of our products." A very general interpretation, you can see, but politically plausible. On the other hand, because the reading of the literature of the American milieu suggests the symptoms of a profound transformation in the American urban landscape and the professional activity in this framework. There were several cases of city transformation at that time, such as Philadelphia's redevelopment, Cleveland Urban Rebuilding Initiative, Detroit Redevelopment Initiative, a transformation that gave emphasis to road connectivity while proposing the abandon of urban continuity as a valid way to shape the city. At this moment, I prefer the later hypothesis, which relates the architectural culture of the continent in a really interesting way, even suggesting as a possible joint reading to open a conversation between two architectural cultures. Maybe that is what Arthur Drexler thought when he proposed in the preface of Latin American architecture since 1945. And I quote, "The significance of the moment has also another and somewhat meaning. Because of the quality of current Latin American building exceed our own, the appearance there of predominantly modern cities give us the opportunity to observe effects which we ourselves still only anticipate." Thank you.
Okay, once more, we want to thank, in the name of the University of Navarra, Dean Wigley, for supporting this seminar in its third edition, to which we are happy to contribute. The year 1964 saw the confluence in the city of New York of two great exhibitions, rather opposite in nature, where Spanish architecture took on protagonism. One was architecture without architects. As we know, the mythical exhibition showed images of anonymous architecture from all over the world, drawing attention to its efficiency and aesthetic attributes. The collection included a good number of photographs of popular Spanish architecture, which thus emerged as a tacit protagonist of the event. The other exhibition was no less notable, the World's Fair. As usual, each country raised its own ephemeral building. The Spanish pavilion was among those that stood out, receiving the gold medal. It was a highly original, brilliant building, out of the ordinary, especially considering what was expected of Spain at that time. Time magazine devoted the cover story to this universal exposition and included a critical article titled "Fairs the World of Already," which said, "The visitor to the New York World's Fair feels that he is in a special world full of runaway pylons, impossible cantilevers, and buildings that look like flowers or accidents of flowing lava. Is it the future? Not exactly." End of quote. Far from these vanities, the Spanish pavilion was one of the few that kept itself on the edges of this discourse. The designer was the young architect Javier Carvajal, and it's fitting to remember him today by way of a tribute because he passed away recently. Each exhibition offered New York's artistic circles two apparently contradictory images of Spanish architecture, and both images were much acclaimed. But they were simply two episodes of one same trajectory, showing much of what was most characteristic of Spain and Spanish architecture, including the contradiction itself, a contradiction perfectly reflected by the title of Rudolph's exhibition, Carvajal's opinion that anonymous popular architecture was not really architecture, and the external appearance of his pavilion so removed from prototypical images of vernacular Spain. So it's not surprising that Kidder Smith was astonished when, combing Europe to publish the new architecture in Europe, he found that, and I quote, "Spain is making one of the most surprising architectural contributions of any country of Europe today." And if this was for him a surprise, it was all the more perplexing to find the simultaneous existence of two antipodal building types, the fantastic Barcelona works of Gaudí and the prismatic white cubes of buildings in Ibiza. His insightful conclusion was, here indeed are the poles of architectural expression. It might be said that their disparity represents one facet of the contrarian tensions endemic in Spain. Kidder Smith had discovered Spanish surrealism in the 60s, but this was something that had caused raves in New York many years before, and surely he knew this. The year 1939, with the Spanish Civil War just ended, saw a very young Dalí designing and building Dream of Venus, the pavilion that in a way represented Spain and the New York World's Fair, constructed by the painter from Caracas on a base of Gaudí's forms. Dalí's festive work could be seen as the extreme representation of the endemic contradiction that underlies the surrealistic attitude that is so Spanish. Probably also seeking fame in New York, Dalí set out to create something flashy at the fair, and it scandalized the public for its daring and provocation, but nevertheless became one of the flagships of the fair. This surrealism that was beaten in the imagery of a still underdeveloped country, attached to vernacular traditions, is perhaps part of what attracted Rudowski's attention at the Metropolitan Museum of Art exhibition called Spectacular Spain, where the Spanish engineer and photographer Ortiz Echagüe was a protagonist with his 89 photographs of landscapes of towns that gave Americans an archaic picture of the Spanish reality, which for many years thereafter defined Spain's image abroad. It was an image whose importance we can calibrate with the fact that those photos were accompanied by a series of engravings by Goya, an important piece of information if we consider that Goya engravings can be thought of as precursors of surrealism. Rudowski looked at vernacular Spanish architecture. Spain's tacit protagonism had its documental translation in the number of images used. Of the 156 images reproduced in the exhibition catalogue, 22 represented Spanish architecture. It helps to situate the seeds of Ortiz Echagüe's inclusion in Rudowski's show in the Met exhibition. The relationship between Ortiz Echagüe and Rudowski was always purely epistolary, as can be gleaned from their correspondence. The complete correspondence reveals great enthusiasm on the part of the Spanish photographer. Rudowski was familiar with the Spanish engineer's photographs and his books. Even he mentioned these books in his letters when requesting a series of photographs for the exhibition. This rudimentary architecture, modest and anonymous, lent itself to attractive photography, showing its perfect implantation in the natural environment. In Spain itself, the images brought back memories of a pleasant and popular heritage that embodies the most genuine of human values and the struggle for survival of a nation already far removed from glories of the past, glories that nevertheless did not wish to give up, as clearly shown by Carvajal in his pavilion. Rudowski, too, with the images provided by Ortiz Echagüe, showed in the exhibition catalogue how the founding fathers of modern architecture took more than one cue from Spanish castles. Functional, austere, the volumes of these fortifications were composed mainly of cubic and cylindrical form, expressions of rationality, efficiency, and economy. Another important Spanish connection to the exhibition was through José Luis Sert, dean at Harvard at that time, on whose recommendation a fellowship was awarded to Rudowski for the exhibition. When he was assigned curator, he wrote to Sert for help and advice. In the letter's description of the exhibition's aim, only one word is underlined, and again the word is modern. And I quote, "What I really want are imaginative photographs taken by architects or photographers with an eye for modern architecture." The journey to tradition, hence, was presented as a mechanism for an essential understanding and deciphering of modernity. Yet, in the exhibition, Spanish architecture was portrayed as a marginal, unpolished atavism of historic tradition whose dazzle came with a declaration of social backwardness and political, economic, and cultural underdevelopment, even though presided by some works of radical freshness and fascinating visual beauty. Of the 22 pictures of Spain displayed, 6 were taken by Rudowski himself. One of these photographs was this image of a street in Ibar, in our province of Navarra. A close-up view of these images illustrates how simple design, freely employed, can produce intricate and, above all, attractive space. Carvajal's pavilion allows us to delve in this direction into Rudowski's intuitions. For the Catalan architect, an encounter with the popular was the seed of certainties upon which to embrace the modern movement. He initiated a study that made him discover the prevalence of the permanent forms and materials of old images, of organic and additive architecture, of constructions bound to the land. It was reality itself and the poverty that illustrated it, not to remain in it, in this endemic surrealism, much less to replicate it with false picturesque, but to understand its essence. This was how Carvajal, with deep introspection, reformulated modernity in his work. The external appearance of the pavilion is plain, almost severe, a play of volumes with closed walls that are ringed and wide in the lower part and grey and arranged in blocks in the upper part, a contrast much found in anonymous popular architecture and in the robust volumes of more cultivated architecture. The biggest contrast awaits us inside, with courtyards and rich spatial sequences, where there is further profusion of examples of artisanship accompanied by diverse images of Spanish architecture, images that surely evoke the spirit that reigned in those of Rudowski's exhibition. That said, the interior gives a very different, even antithetical message. The exhibition itself conveys it. As Andrea Bocco writes, in his installation at the MoMA, the space appears crowded with a forest of vertical and horizontal lines, creating a setting in which buildings without pedigree are visible, juxtaposed in accordance with Rudowski's approach. Architecture without architects radically disembedded the indigenous structure it pictured from their geographical, historical, and cultural settings, and put them into play within an explicitly modernist structure reminiscent of the stele. The two views are juxtaposed, and to a certain extent, the viewer is confronted with the impossible reconciliation of two extremes of the discourse. Carvajal didn't have to confront these discourses, and he dissolved the juxtaposition of container and content by trying for an explicit integration of all arts. In the vitrines lit by aluminium lamps that repeat the scheme of the ceiling scoffers, the products on display, no matter how insignificant, were presented like jewels. The objects on display referred to the essence of the Spanish culture, and through a common discourse interacted with the architecture surrounding them. So the spectator was not confronted with an indecipherable abstraction, but was wrapped in a special atmosphere that identified a deep tradition as reinterpreted by modernity. These magical interiors were sometimes rather cluttered, almost messy, popular, presenting the exotic with influences from near and far, Hispanic or Moorish, woven in the light of modern spatiality. It's not surprise then that these recreated landscapes aroused wide interest in the United States. The pavilion was also a model for the integration of art and architecture, and as such endeavored to be a living manifestation of the much debated on total work. Classic works of Spanish painting were put on display, but so were numerous works of art created especially for the pavilion. Painters and sculptors went along with the spirit that Carvajal printed upon the space. So there were sculpture of Isabel the Catholic by José Luis Sánchez and Fray Junipero by Pablo Serrano, but also paintings by Vaquero Turcios. The enclosures and windows were works of prominent artists, among them the sculptor Labarta, who contributed several lattices that were modular in nature, with repeated structures. Again, formal systematization was joined with something with a long tradition. In Spain, the wooden lattice. Picasso's triptych, The Painter and the Model, was expressively acquired by the Spanish Pavilion for the permanent exhibition of contemporary art, along with works by Miró and Dalí. It's easy to picture how hard it was to get the Malagas-born painter to take part in an exhibition that presented to the world the essence of the country over and above politics, when that country was, in fact, being governed by the Franco regime. The display of drawings by the poet Federico García Lorca was relevant in the same way. The American public, so well acquainted with his literary works, had a rare opportunity to admire another of his most personal and deepest facets, his drawings. The pavilion's success and the coming out brand of Spain had a tremendous impact both at home and abroad, as was patent in media that covered it, ABC, New York Times, International Herald Tribune, etc. When news came that the first prize in the World's Fair had gone to the Spanish pavilion, the waitress who habitually served the Carvajal's breakfast said, "Mr. Architect, let me pay for you today. You have made me proud to be a Spanish." The often recounted anecdote illustrates to what extent Spanish pride found shelter in Carvajal's pavilion, and also to what extent Spaniards held its content to be authentically theirs. And all this was profoundly satisfying for the architect, who would thereafter always remind his students about it. Spanish pride, which perhaps for the first time came out to the streets in New York, invading the city. Another encounter brought the next to last contradiction. The architect who pulled Spain out of autarky coincided with Mies van der Rohe in an unforgettable discussion at the Harvard Club on Fifth Avenue. The German master told Carvajal, "I can give you a piece of advice. If you want to be successful with your pavilion, don't use serialization nor prefabrication." When Carvajal replied that one could expect such advice from any architect but him, Mies said, "On the contrary, I'm the only one who can give you that advice. I invented those things," and pointing to Fifth Avenue with a large gesture of his hand, "Look what they've done with my invention." So, the contrary of Spanish architecture was portrayed in 4 New York exhibitions, ranging from Dalí's most radical surrealism, which Carvajal was not unfamiliar with, to the modern serialization on the latter's pavilion years later. We can look at the Spanish pavilion as an attempt to synthesize and resolve contradictions. In a way, it succeeded in doing so. An abstraction of remote Mediterranean or Hispanic Moorish reminiscences served as a container for the vernacular tradition of more updated Spanish essences. Maybe for this reason, it's not surprised that Dalí himself, who often visited Carvajal's pavilion, ended up saying, "It's incredible how Spain triumphs in the World's Fair. Carvajal is an excellent architect who has built in New York a work of architecture well representative of Spanish tradition, with a solution of lines of exceptional refinement." For there is no living tradition, and we end here, that belongs to modern man, but that which comes from subtle processes of synthetic and creative contradiction. And the architect Carvajal stayed true to this all his life. The symbolic image of the pomegranate that adorned the official guide of the Spanish pavilion was a near-perfect icon, summary of what the 4 mentioned exhibitions displayed and represented. For it was the same pomegranate, a design of José Luis Sánchez, the same sculpture that put it in the hands of Queen Isabel the Catholic, that would preside the entrance of one of the 2 houses Carvajal built in Madrid that same year, outstanding examples of the new Spanish architecture of the 20th century and of the new spirit that had its world premiere in New York in 1964. Thank you so much.
Hi. So the theme is documentary remains, which seems to me at the very least is a triple question. One would be what remains of exhibitions, like what kind of document is left behind. 2, what kind of document is an exhibition in the first place, like what kind of remains are exhibited. in an exhibition? And 3, combining the two, what does it mean to exhibit the remains of an exhibition by talking about it, for example, at a symposium like this one today? So why not go directly to the question of the exhibition of human remains? The tradition of the relic, which is probably is in virtually every known religion. I mean the exhibition of body parts, fingers, limbs, skulls, teeth, and hair. In this case, the hand of St. Francis Xavier, the 16th century saint, this hand which resides in the mother church of the Jesuit religion, the building on the right, argued to be the first, by the way, the first truly Baroque facade in architecture. So a hand encased in a vitrine, encased in an altar, in a chapel inside a work of architecture completed 1584, which is not long before the hand itself arrived, having been chopped off the body of the saint, which was in India. And not just any hand, the hand with which the saint touched and blessed the people that he encountered. His fingernail is in another place in Rome. His toe is in Lisbon. There's another hand in Japan, and actually, but the main body, the torso, is in India, where he died. And the hand, and all of these objects are quite mobile. So this is the hand in Australia, since he is the patron saint of Australia. So the hand went to visit, and so this hand, which was in India, cut off, detached from the body in 1614, went to Rome, and then from Rome to Australia, and then back again. And this is, in fact, the tradition of the relic, which is to say dispersed mobile body parts on exhibition within the wider exhibition space of a church. And a church is not just one exhibition space amongst others. It's not clear that we can think the concept of exhibition without thinking about the extraction of objects from the space of the church to form the collections around which the concept of exhibition currently survives, which is also, of course, the kind of construction of the categories of, for example, painting and sculpture as distinct from architecture. So this beginning of exhibition is also, as it were, the beginning of the mobility of art objects as objects which could therefore be on display in a market, etc., etc. So it seems to me we should, when thinking about these kinds of questions, return to the space of the church. And in this space to find these body parts, but not just body parts, because in the tradition of the relic, there are the body parts, but there is also the clothing worn by those bodies, or the objects that have been touched by that body, including, for example, footprints, which are on display. The relic, you could say, actually must say, is an object that touches because it has been touched. And this is the hand as it's about to head off in its vitrine to Australia. So the body part itself has been touched, either from the inside or from the outside. All exhibitions involve such a spacing of mobile objects. You could even argue, I am arguing, that this spacing produces an imaginary whole, an imaginary body, out of mobile remains. Remains whose movement is temporarily and visibly suspended. So in this image, the vitrine marks the suspension of the movement. So it both conveys the movement being in someone else's hands, the hands in the hands, and as you can see, it's not just the hand, but the bone of the hand. So the hand, as it were, displayed, is for a moment stilled, made still. So this gesture of exhibition is also a gesture which requires mobility, but also requires the suspension of mobility for the moment of experiencing the object. In this sense, objects have to be first made to appear to be fragments of something bigger through tactics of exhibition. In fact, the gesture of removing the hand from the body then allows the hand to, as it were, be evidence of a body. And all objects, in this sense, are treated that way. In fact, exhibitions produce the effect of a set of fragments which are then spaced, and a kind of construction appears that links them together. There is therefore no exhibition without the sense of fragment, and this is not about size. Fragment is not a question of size. You can exhibit the planet Earth, indeed it was exhibited, but only as part of something slightly bigger. For example, when the Earth was photographed and displayed. But let's push this a little bit further. There's really no sense of fragment without exhibition. You cannot see something as being a fragment of a wider whole without an experience of exhibition. So actually to put an object on display requires you to subordinate the object. It becomes an object in the moment of its subordination to a wider image. And that's the moment in which the object becomes evidence of something, returning to this word evidence. And so exhibition is never simply a spacing of objects, but is also a spacing of and through concepts. Concepts become, as it were, the medium for the spacing. There has to be, from the very beginning, a conceptual mechanism for identifying what is an object that could be available for your view. And that's exactly what spacing is a kind of production of the sense that there is an object in front of you, but this spacing requires a kind of conceptual logic. In other words, the only object that could ever be displayed is a partial object. It is only object in the sense of it being, as it were, incomplete. And in that sense, we are speaking of a spacing of partial documents, some on show, but as has already been referred to in the earlier panel, most of them behind the scenes. So just to add one more layer to this introductory series of remarks, the act of display also involves editing, archiving, hiding, and storing. In other words, acts of burial, substantial acts of burial in order to allow the object to appear. Now this is just a very long-winded way of saying that exhibition is only ever the exhibition of remains. So what I want to do is look at what remains of an exhibition. To look at what remains of an exhibition, for example, at a conference like this one, is necessarily to exhibit the production of remains. It's the mechanisms by which the remains are produced. I'll give one example, which is I'm going to speak about the fragmentary remains of an exhibition of remains. Sorry for that. Class of 1959. It's a February 1959 exhibition at Cambridge University of paintings by Magda Cordell, sculptures by Eduardo Palazzi, and collages by John McHale. This exhibition appears in the CVs of all three artists, and it appears in timelines of the independent group that they were all part of. But there's zero discussion of it in all the endless studies of the independent group being a holy site in the world of architecture because it's the birthplace, the incubator of pop art. So here is an exhibition which is marked in the timelines, but is completely absent other than its title. It's not even a ghost. That would be to render it sort of more interesting than it is. And I'm not arguing here that this is an important exhibition. I'm just wanting to place what remains of this exhibition within a wider ecology. I'm just trying to understand the gesture of spacing that would allow the pushing apart of objects and the burial, the forms of burial that were required to produce the sense of a set of objects. In other words, locating the remains of this show and placing them in a historical space, acting as a historian, spacing them here in front of you here today, putting this unseen exhibition itself on exhibition by making it a fragment of a bigger story. Sorry. I guess the number of apologies has to increase. So the first question is, what is the public record? Well, we have one brochure, one review, and one article. That's it, in the public domain. This is the brochure, which is also the poster. It's a list of the works. There's an image for each of the artists, and there's a theoretical text by Lawrence Alloway, of course, another member of the independent group. He says in the text that these images, quote, coin an image of man, and he insists that this is not a picture of man, but a symbol. And he says what's common to all three artists is that each of these figures of man have a clearly defined outer contour, which acts as a container for a whole what he calls swarm of marks, and it is those swarm of marks that makes this human. It's not the shape of the contour, but the swarming going on. Palazzi is identified as having presented 6 male bodies in his sculptures. Magda Cordell is identified as presenting 6 female bodies. And McHale is presented as having 7 hybrid bodies, which are, and therefore, of course, positioned in the middle. So Palazzi at the top, McHale, and then Cordell. And he's off to one side, to the left, because he's the sort of synthetic figure. This is a collection of fragments, a kind of micro-exhibition here on the brochure, with McHale's collages effectively used to explain the whole show. And this is McHale's basic, Alloway's basic point is that McHale's, quote, human images arise from what they incorporate, and so on and so on. He says Mikhail's people are cultural products, as are we. So, of course, he's playing on the double sense of the word human expression, human image. Images of humans, but also image by humans. It's all collapsed here into an image of the human constituting itself as human by consuming images. He says, we consumers, defined by what they use. All three artists, he says, are connected with pop art's monster fund, the Frankenstein monster, which, as he says, is raw material learning humanity. And, of course, on the left-hand side of the brochure is the literal construction of a new body out of partial pieces of the bodies of the different artists, again with Mikhail in the center, a kind of exquisite corpse in the surrealist sense, despite the fact that Allaway is insisting that this work is not surrealist. These are mobile remains literally constituting a new body, a hypothetical body constructed out of the works of a series of artists. Okay, can we get outside of this internal narrative, or we can go to the review? The problem is that the review is written in the Cambridge Review of the university where the exhibition took place, and it's written by a man who was teaching drawing at the School of Architecture that was very involved in the exhibition. So let's move on. But it insists on the human image, male, female, all the things I've said so far. There is one article about the show, but it's in Lady Clare, which is the college in which the exhibition was hosted, written by Robert Friedman, who was the curator of the exhibition, and it's titled The Human Image, has Mikhail and Cordell, and polemically Palazzi is left out. But it also publishes two pages from Mikhail's expendable icon articles that had appeared literally in the same months of the original exhibition. So what you have here is a combination of the human image and the expendable icon, but we haven't found ourselves outside of the exhibition, and that we've now exhausted the public record. That's it. I could stop and maybe should. But let's go to the private record. We could find the press release for the exhibition, but we wouldn't be surprised that all the same points are already made there, the human image, the expendable icon, etc. We could go deeper now. We could discover some absolutely obscure color transparencies of the exhibition, which, if you color correct them, do start to give you a sense of what's going on. We see all three artists here, Palazzi, Mikhail, Cordell. In this image, we see three of the paintings of Magda, Eduardo's sculpture, and again, two sculptures and so on. We're starting to get a sense of the exhibition. But actually, the image, we don't know the complete organization of the exhibition. There is another set of photographs which actually show Eduardo Palazzi arriving at the exhibition, and we can finally discover where this thing was. And even we see the artists, and we could start to fantasize what they are thinking about and what they are drinking, and the combination of alcohol, cigarettes, and so on, and the general sort of stylistic atmosphere in which almost everybody that seems to have attended the exhibition are men and students, and maybe Cambridge was a place where male students gathered. We also could start to see in these images the works themselves and start to analyze what we might think. And the more you look, the more you can, through these social images, as it were, start to make a map of where the various documents of the exhibition are. Again, I remind you, very attractive woman and a number of male students. We can even go forensic in analyzing who we might discover at the exhibition. And again, if you look at this sequence, which is interesting, of course, because the brochure I showed you is in the sequence, we see Eduardo Palazzi symptomatically standing with his back to one of Mikhail's works so that that work would not be seen by the people he's talking to. And then there's a series of color images which are even more interesting because these are the moment at which the exhibition is being installed, and so you could start to fantasize about what's going on. Again, there's no doubt one can see that Palazzi is trying to rule the show, and Mikhail is trying to look like an artist, thoughtfully, Magda pensive. You can start to locate the works of art and understand the situation. But actually, none of the images I showed you so far would allow you to reconstruct the exhibition, even though we have the labels of them. We could look at the letters from the curator to. We don't find any information about what was the theory of the exhibition. We can even see John Mikhail's sketching out where the various works would be held, and that would enable us to position them, but actually the location he marks on this image does not match the photograph, so they're not really of much help. We could go 2 months earlier to the three collagists exhibition at the ICA, where John Mikhail had virtually the same set of works of art, and look at his theory. His theory there is that of the expendable icon. So once again, the collision of expendable icon and the human image. This is from a British movie display of that exhibition. It was heavily covered in the media. In other words, this was an exhibition that is in the record, is discussed, and the prominence of Mikhail is clearly identified, but we'd have to go again to the issue of Upcase, edited by Theo Crosby, in which you find Mikhail, but again, Mikhail and Cordell are in a separate section, again associated with Palazzi, and here there is an expression used of the multi-evocative image, which goes back to this exhibition in which once again Mikhail appears alongside Palazzi, Cordell and the rest, and Lawrence Alloway yet again insists on the human image as the basic concept and the multi-evocative image, which goes back to 1954 when he made his first speech about the human image in this seminar at the ICA, and in the very same month published an article about Palazzi in which he speaks exactly of this point of the human image. So in other words, to understand an exhibition about the human image in Cambridge in 1959, about which we still, despite the fact that I've shown you everything there is to be shown, you have no idea what that show was about. It was about this thing called the human image, which was incubated back in 1954, producing this kind of work. But what about the expendable icon? This is a Mikhail concept developed when he was studying at Yale, and he gave it in a lecture 1955 in New York, which was literally covered by the New York Times. And he then writes, this is the manuscript of that lecture, he then sends a copy of that to Magda Cordell in London, pleading with her not to show it to Alloway because he's sure that Alloway will steal the concept of expendable icon because he's already stolen the concept of the human image. These are the best friends. Nobody steals like your friends. He proposes that after he comes back from Yale and after the This Is Tomorrow exhibition, they should do an exhibition on the expendable icon and the human image. It doesn't happen. What happens after the exhibition is that Robert Freeman then does an issue of the Cambridge Opinion. This issue is extremely important because it has in it three of the most important essays by Mikhail, by Alloway, and by Rayner Banham, the three main theorists of the independent group. Robert Freeman then organizes this exhibition in 1960 of Cambridge students in London. He invites Mikhail and Cordell to come to this, and in every one of his invitations, he insults Palazzi for having been a rip-off artist, self-promoter, and exploiting the reputation. So basically, the famous artist already at this point, Palazzi, is being denigrated by Freeman. He sends another note. You notice that his own photography is in the same kind of genre, and he again is insulting at every turn Palazzi. Which just leaves us here to conclude with this image from 1963. This is a photograph by the same Robert Freeman of Richard Hamilton sitting in this organization. This is what Hamilton calls a self-portrait. And by self-portrait, he means not simply his own body inside the gridiron uniform, but the entire arrangement of technology and imagery and so on. This new kind of prosthetically expanded identity, these series of fragmentary body parts, all of these are understood as body parts. So quite literally, we can say that the sort of phantom exhibition of the class of 1959, organized by Robert Freeman, falls at the exact center of a timeline from 53 to 63, in which these concepts of human image and expendable icon will, as it were, be intertwined and will culminate in this image. And this is 1963, and this is the year in which the Beatles will, for the first time, become the #1 pop singers. This is when pop went from pop art, from popular arts to pop, to actual pop. And not by accident, Robert Freeman, the curator of this phantom exhibition, was the photographer of all of the early album covers of the Beatles. Freeman became himself considerably more famous, you could say, considerably more in the world, in the confusion of fine art and pop art that the independent group thought of. He could be arguably the greatest success of the independent group, because he literally was producing the pop art of pop. I still have nothing to tell you about the 1959 class of 59 show, but it's in the middle of all this stuff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all three. May I invite everybody to come up to the table for our discussion? Okay, thank you all for a fabulous set of presentations, which will undoubtedly dovetail into some of the discussion from earlier and open up new ideas. Maybe I'll start off with a quick question about the role of the curator in all these talks, which in some of the talks, like for example in Carlos, we didn't hear much about the curator. There was a lot about the architect, there was a lot about the exhibition, but presumably in there must have been a curator. With Horacio, we sort of could tell that, right, there was a story about MoMA's curators traveling, and MoMA as a type of reception mechanism, or the curator maybe even as a type of apparatus of reception as it travels and gobbles up different things. And with Mark, the curator is in a sense in as much the artists themselves than anybody else, and there is a lot of contention in the space of the exhibition is not one of let's say unison or one message, but in fact you've opened up the reality that this was not quite all one voice. So when we think of an exhibition, I think we also think of the voice of the curator as being a type of assertive voice. But you've all, in a sense, put that idea into some sort of question. So if I may start with you, Carlos, you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, you're very right. And in fact, I mean, the presentation was more try to be deeper in terms of architecture and relation with the Rudowski's exhibition and Carvajal's pavilion. But in fact, in Rudowski, of course, the curator is Rudowski, and all the material he was obtaining through his travels, even the travel in Spain 2 years before the exhibition, and of course his travels around the world, because many, in fact, 22 images of the exhibition were taken by Rudowski himself. But the next photographer was Ortiz Echagüe, the second one in number of images for that exhibition. So really, in Rudowski's exhibition, the role of the curator is important, almost critical. And we saw that the way the exhibition was mounted in a way, and this has been referred to by Andrea Bocco in his Rudowski Human Designer book, Rudowski as a Human Designer, and that's where he also deals with the figure of Rudowski as curator of that exhibition, with what I tried to say, saying that he's placing these images from vernacular architecture opposed in a way with this montage of their steel reminiscences, okay? He's facing the world of modern spatiality towards the images. Whereas in the case of the pavilion, I mean, in fact, the curator is, there was an artist, the name is Labra, who was the artist in charge of all the arrangement for the rest of the artists. But we could say that the figure of the architect as well is a kind of curator for the same exhibition, because what he's doing is trying to create a spatiality and bringing all the artists to work in his piece of art. So what we have seen from José Luis Sánchez or Vaquero Turcios or all these artists, they were creating these pieces specifically for the pavilion. And then some of them, they remained in the state, which is great. Fray Junipero by Pablo Serrano is in California, and Queen Elizabeth the Catholic, I think, is in Washington. So in a way, we have the curator in Rudowski, and then the architect as a curator for his own pavilion, I would say.
Horacio?
Well, I think the role of the curator in the case of Latin American architecture was the main role. I tried to explain two things. One is the ideas of this kind of paradigm of realizing exhibitions from Latin America, which Russell Hitchcock repeat actually the same ideas that came out with Brazil Builds. And the second is this presentation of this urban facade, which actually the material reality of the Latin American city was showing, and he probably know it from the first hand because he traveled a lot to all the cities. But this is the kind of different idea. Maybe he explained with a strong originality things. And it's a little part of the exhibition. It's only 2 panels from 53 panels, only 2 is this original idea. The others are the ideas from a paradigm to learn or to study the Latin American architecture.
Mark.
Well, I mean, in terms of the way the material was presented today, I mean, you could see Robert Freeman as the sort of anti-hero, but he would never be defined as the curator. In fact, his name doesn't appear anywhere in the official record of the shows. He was a student photographer, so you could say he acted as he was a fan, and he acted as the conduit for all the anxieties of the independent group, who, like most very successful and influential groups, didn't like each other. So they spent such a lot of time trying to prove to each other that they were smarter than each other. The collective intelligence went up through this kind of bad behavior. So the resentment of the group fully passed through Freeman. The show that he put together, and again, he's not identified in any way with the so-called Scrooge exhibition of 1960 in London, but Alloway, who's fast on his way to being one of the most influential art critics in the world at that time, writes about that show and says this is the beginning of the next generation of pop art and so on. And then he invites Freeman to be his assistant at the ICA, and at the ICA, Freeman curates a series of lectures called Images of Tomorrow. So probably Freeman is what attracts me to him is that he actually never has the official position of the director of anything, the curator of anything, but quietly he's the conduit for this kind of creativity. And then he sort of slipstreams past everybody into the Beatles via John Coltrane and other things. So I think that the figure of the curator is not very strong in the independent group trajectory. The word organizer is quite prominent. So I've never, you're asking a question that's more interesting than my answer. I don't know the status of the figure of the curator during that period.
Well, I mean, another way to look at the figure of the curator is the traces that they leave. And in your case, there are not a lot of traces. And there is a type of self-effacement of that curator, probably because he was a little bit junior, perhaps, to the people he was working with. But I imagine that in the MoMA exhibition, there was a big wall label before you walked in, where the curator would in a sense, frame your idea of what you're about to see in 250 words or less, or something like that, right? So that was not the case.
The first was the Fatima Church from Oscar Niemeyer.
Okay.
So that sets a lot.
So there was no text?
No.
There was no. That's very interesting.
The third one.
The MoMA has gone a long way. Now there's always text.
There are two main pictures. One is Fatima, and the other one was Cerro Piloto in Caracas.
Well, maybe we return to the figure of the curator later and the kinds of traces that we can explore, because it seems to me that the curator is certainly looked upon as responsible for this type of spacing that Mark was referring to, between this conceptual spacing, literally creating the space between the fragments that are exhibited and modulating how close one object is to the other to create tension, to create relationships that are as much visual as attempts to gently predispose the viewer to get something out of the exhibition. And so I love that image when he's standing in front of the painting. He doesn't want that one to be seen. So I think but Mark was talking about a type of spacing that I think was also present in your presentations, which had to do with literally traveling across continents and across countries. The way that these exhibitions circulate sometimes are not fully as exhibitions. Fragments of them travel in journals. What do you see are the risks in travel? I mean, there is travel insurance for the works, right? Things can happen to them. What would be the type of conceptual insurance that you would take out? Or would you care to issue such a policy?
Well, one way to get into that question might be via surrealism, because I think actually surrealism was evident in all three. But in theory, if part of the surrealism of Dali's installation has to do with putting things together in an interior that are not supposed to be together, and presumably Carvajal's pavilion is supposed to be successful because everything inside the pavilion, they all do belong together, because the mythical corpus of Spain is represented by this. And in Horacio's point, this brilliant invention of a new kind of Latin American city out of all the fragments that have been gathered together, in that case it explodes back out, like traveling and collecting individual evidence. So I think that what's interesting is the time period is the same, of course. 54 to 64, 54 to 64. These are the same time period in which you could argue that Carvajal's pavilion is a sort of spectacular accomplishment of popular art, according to this definition, and that the Museum of Modern Art is trying to put Latin America inside a vitrine through a very surrealist gesture of burying most of the evidence to produce this effect. So if you want to, what is the most surreal of all the moves here? It's MoMA. I think MoMA is the winner. way beyond independent group, way beyond, I mean, just the sort of chutzpah, the sort of arrogance of we could do that. I mean, Rockefeller.
Right.
Yes. I mean, that's an artwork. I mean, the point would be the curator as artist, in this case, producing a spectacular reimagination of an unbelievable, impossible, unreal Latin America.
Yes, but I feel
I agree with you. Yeah, and in the case of Spain, I guess that this surrealism, the information for it, at least in Carvajal, comes from the reality itself. I mean, it's just this kind of underdeveloped country that produced all these images that were shown by Tortilla. And before being shown at MoMA, we just discovered yesterday, in fact, they went to the Metropolitan Museum. We just discovered that we were first in an exhibition in Kentucky. So this has to do with these troubling things, right? So this exhibition, all these images of this underdeveloped country, producing these connections also with engravings by Goya, all these personages, all these people that are from a different world, right? And when presented in a different country, they start in Kentucky. We don't know why they were there, but then certainly Rudolfsky knew about that, and then came to the Met and then to MoMA. So the same photographs, but connecting with the previous point that they were, the same photographs were just hanging around the country, which makes another point.
The exhibition. Well, the main ideas of Russell Hitchcock was this fusion between modern principles and regional and cultural issues. It's amazing because this part of the exhibition was out of these ideas, and also when the exhibition traveled, went to Caracas, La Habana, and Mexico City, this part was out of the traveling.
Oh.
The part of this new Latin analogous Latin American city was out of the exhibition in Latin America.
Why?
I don't know why, because I just realized yesterday at the MoMA archives.
Yeah, we also got that yesterday.
Well, but I love the connection through surrealism. It's true, it's there, and then surrealism, of course, is always unbelievable. It sort of puts into question the whole idea, the reality principle, and so much of these exhibitions was, especially both of your exhibitions, were about creating a type of belief, no, that this thing exists out there in the world, and you might question that, or you might go along with it. But can you comment a little bit on this, on this reality principle, or this? Are we talking about three unbelievable exhibitions in the sense that they're just they don't match up to anything that we might call reality, or what? How?
Yeah, it's difficult. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe how we get this information from the real source of reality. I think it comes to my mind now about this reality as a source of.
Right.
One of the sentences that Le Corbusier wrote when he traveled to Spain, I think it was 1929, 30, I think it was 1929. When he was seeing all these people in the countryside, and he was drawing the donkeys and all these things, and he wrote how these people had a sense of intuitive administration of beauty. And that sense, I said, well, maybe it's something, of course, very real, but at the same time, it's quite intuitive, the way they administrate all this beauty. And maybe there's another point that comes to my mind now.
I mean, for the independent group, surrealism is unambiguously the framework. They're all deeply knowledgeable in surrealism, and the people they hate the most are the most associated with surrealism. So when for example, Alloway describes 1954 Palazzi's drawings, and in so doing, for the first time uses his key concepts like the pop art and so on, he's insisting that they're not surrealists. So I think the independent group, to say this too simply, believed that they were realists, and reality was information, packaging, style, plastic, advertising, weirdly enough, America. That was reality. So what reality was, sort of system of illusions that were operating as mass culture. So it really worked. They really worked on that issue. That was the main point. So Freeman's success would be just inevitable consequences of his realistic understanding of the world of imagery. So I think they thought of themselves as documentary. The weird flip, of course, is that if surrealism is understood to be, as it were, natural to Spain, which explains why, for example, Almodovar is a documentary maker, filmmaker, and anybody who spent some time in Spain knows it's like that. That's an interesting twist. That in this very same moment, surrealism is being naturalized. I mean, this is what I like. I like this, the fact that you place these four projects simultaneously in New York in parallel. What does it mean to naturalize surrealism? Right.
But you also you've just brought up this question of the relationship to reality as being, in a sense, fundamental to what we think of as documentation. And in the previous discussion, we were talking about the unease with the document or the production of documents. And that unease seemed to come up in the discussion when the document resembles too much reality, right? Everybody's taking a photo with their iPhone and it's sort of circulating, it's replacing reality. Or when it's not close enough to reality, it's a complete fiction. Sort of it unhinges itself entirely from reality. And in these, all three presentations, there was a really interesting tension. The word documentation didn't really quite come up. It was always there. It sort of didn't need to come up. But that tension was there, where you begin to experience that some of the projects, like the one doing an exhibition on Spain or on Latin America, do have this whole attempt to represent reality. right? So this is Latin America, this is Spain, and of course we can blame them for not doing it properly. They don't do it right. Anyway, I don't want to carry on, but you see what I would be interested in your thoughts on this. On this question of documentation, if you can expand on it a little bit. So who is, for example, doing the documenting? If there is such a thing in each of your projects, who's the criminal, to go back to the previous discussion?
I think it's a very interesting question, because in the Latin American architecture exhibition, all the works were very well known and published in glossy papers. So the journey to Latin America and to take pictures, it's amazing, because you need to put again some difference just to look the same work another time, and only the operation is just to put all these very well known cases together.
Yeah, well, in the case of Spain, is more like all the imagery of the vernacular Spain, how vernacular Spain is treated in one way by Rudowski, and how vernacular Spain is treated in a different manner by Carvajal. Because obviously he's not redoing the picturesque, but he wants to, in a way, what we all know by trying to get to the essences of things. How this is achieved by Carvajal, I think, is also in a profound contradiction for himself, because he was a very contradictory man, even in his personality. So he would produce all the dreams, and at the same time all the very real things coming together. So I think that, of course, there are two different approaches from Rudowski's view than for Carvajal's view.
Yeah, I don't know. Again, returning to the sort of fiction of the independent group, they are marked by having three very, very strong theorists, Banham, Allaway, and McHale, one of whom, McHale, was also an artist, but then you had a series of very strong artists, all of whom also wrote theory. So Alexander Peter Smithson, Richard Hamilton, etc. So I think it's very risky to generalize across that field, but I don't think any of them had the view of documents as being, as it were, the hidden truth of the situation. The documents that they considered were understood to actually constitute the lived environment. So you lived in a set of documents. It was not that you would do a kind of research about the hidden secret of a Betty Crocker cake mix. The truth of that situation was in the way in which the image itself was constructed of this impossible miracle cake. And I think, so to some extent, they would reject the idea of a documentary layer. The documents that mattered to them were right up front. And some of their training is entirely classical, like Banham has a PhD at the Courtauld Institute and so on. So he has the capacity to go to play the game of archival depth, but they actually reject that in the kind of Oscar Wilde sense, when Oscar Wilde says that only superficial people believe in depth. I mean, they really thought that to be serious was to be dealing with the surface.
Are there any questions from the audience? Maria? I think there's a microphone. If you can just wait a second. I think it's running around somewhere. There.
Thank you for all your papers, and Jorge for how you frame the discussion. So I have a question. It's sort of very straightforward, and I think it puts together both of your comments, Jorge, which has to do with who's making this documenting, and sort of behind or above or below the role of the curator. The reality that seems to me that it's been constructed in all these different exhibitions is whatever institution sort of that curator is playing within or working for. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that relationship in the different contexts. It seems to me, Mark, that in yours it's sort of the same. No, these people are the institution, but from ICA to MoMA to Franquismo, there seems to me there is going to be a change of scale in that relationship.
MoMA and Franco on the same.
Sorry, you put them together.
Same level.
Many things going on.
No, I wonder whether it's actually a.
Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah, yes, a great one. Yeah, it's a great question. Starting for my, let's say, what touches me more. In fact, the pavilion, the 64 pavilion, was just to put the brand of Spain from a Franco regime outside of the country, right? How can a country by a regime like Franco can be, in very commas, sold outside? And why, for instance, Picasso, how Picasso allows himself to present three words here, the triplet. And even the Spanish state acquired those paintings specifically for the pavilion, because Picasso, of course, didn't want to at all to work with the Franco regime, but finally he did. I don't know if it's true or not. I was given an anecdote by the Secretary General of the pavilion. I mean, all the people who were involved in the pavilion, of course, they are all dead except one. Last week, the press coordinator died, and still alive, the Secretary General, right? And we interviewed him, and the general, and he told me about that. And maybe there was a very genuine Spanish contradictory. There was a bullfighter who was a close friend of Picasso and a close friend of Franco. And he said that maybe that's what he told me about. Maybe it was him who connected both in order to allow and bring a picture to New York. So, difficult question.
In the case of MoMA, you have not only one curator. Maybe the main ideas came from Russell Hitchcock, but also from the chief of the International Circulating Department, the Architecture and Design Department, Arthur Drexler, and also from Nelson Rockefeller.
In the case of the independent group, no ICA, no independent group. The independent group is the ICA label for this group of kids who wanted to annoy them, and they started annoying them in 1952, and by 1962 they were running the show. So the independent group is a fiction of the ICA, and the ICA is an exhibition space. So in terms of the theme of this conference, a set of galleries created, were the staging place for a kind of intellectual project, which was heterogeneous and multiple, but couldn't have existed without what was perceived to be an extremely boring space run by a group of very boring men. So it required an institution to hate that thought it could suppress you by inviting you in once a week, and lost.
Another question? Okay. Well, we're out of time. I think there's a coffee break now. Thank you all for your presentations.
Thank you.
Hello. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and for technical reasons, Liz Diller will go first, followed by Beatriz Colomina, followed by Nikolaus Hirsch. Thank you very much.
That is really bad. You want to speak before? So how to press the images? Exactly. I think you go like here, but I don't know. Mark? How did you? Sorry, you're in the.
No, it's fine.
How do you?
This one here.
This is how you do it, right?
Yeah.
And then the light is here. Sorry.
Yeah.
And how does this work?
It starts at 15 and it counts down. It starts blinking.
How does it know
really
when you're cut?
They can do
They
it.
control it
It's
from
brilliant.
there.
It's actually amazing.
It's
We've
an
never had
amazing
this
idea.
before.
It's kind of nerve-wracking, but.
No, but it's kind of nice.
You can do a favor.
No, I think it's fantastic. It's like a video game. I know. I was like, I guess.
Okay, I'll figure it out.
That's it. That's because she wants it. Awesome.